Desmond Doss entered the world on February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, a quiet town far removed from any battlefield, but deeply shaped by discipline and faith. His upbringing unfolded inside a strict Seventh-day Adventist household where Scripture was treated as instruction, not metaphor, and where moral lines were drawn clearly and never blurred. His mother reinforced those values daily, while his father, a World War I veteran, returned home carrying the weight of violence he rarely spoke about. One moment, during Doss's youth, fixed those beliefs permanently. After witnessing a violent confrontation at home, he stood staring at a framed list of the 10 Commandments, and his attention settled on a single line, "Thou shalt not kill," which he accepted without condition or exception. From that point forward, killing was never an option for him, regardless of circumstance, authority, or uniform. That conviction followed him into adulthood and did not change when the United States entered World War II after December 7, 1941. Military service was not something Doss tried to avoid, and avoiding responsibility never crossed his mind. In April 1942, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, but he made his position clear immediately, explaining that he would serve as a combat medic, accept frontline duty, and refuse to carry a weapon. Training camp became his first real test. Other soldiers ridiculed him openly, calling him weak, reckless, and dangerous, convinced that a man without a rifle would get them killed. The harassment moved quickly from insults to physical abuse, isolation, and deliberate attempts to provoke him into breaking his stance. Boots were thrown while he prayed, his bedding was kicked away, and humiliation became routine rather than occasional. Commanders reacted with little patience. Court-martial threats followed him through training, and paperwork was prepared to have him removed under psychiatric claims. The Army had little tolerance for soldiers who refused weapons in the middle of a global war, and more than once Doss was told directly that there was no place for him in a combat unit. None of that altered his position. Each confrontation ended the same way, with Doss explaining calmly that he was willing to die for his country, but would not take another life for it, which meant punishment was acceptable, but violating his conscience was not. Military lawyers eventually ruled that his beliefs were sincere and legally protected, leaving the Army with one choice: to keep him and send him forward without a rifle. Medic training replaced marksmanship. Doss learned how to stop bleeding, treat shock, stabilize fractures, and move wounded men under fire, skills that mattered most where soldiers collapsed fastest. He completed training without firing a single shot, accepted every other order given, and asked for no special treatment beyond being allowed to serve. In 1944, he shipped out with the 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division, bound for the Pacific Theater, where combat erased any remaining illusion of distance or safety. Jungle warfare closed space brutally, heat destroyed equipment and bodies alike, and Japanese defensive doctrine relied on ambush, concealment, and refusal to surrender. Medics worked where men fell, not behind the lines. Doss proved his worth almost immediately during fighting on Guam, moving under fire to treat wounded soldiers, while bullets cut through vegetation and explosions churned the ground around him. Dragging men from exposed positions, working in full view of the enemy, and staying forward longer than expected changed how his unit saw him. The ridicule faded, replaced by something closer to trust. Okinawa would demand far more. In April 1945, American forces landed on the island that stood between the Allies and Japan itself, and Japanese defenses had turned the terrain into a network of tunnels, ridges, and kill zones that artillery could not clear. One position dominated the battlefield, a sheer escarpment rising roughly 400 feet. known to U.S. troops as Hacksaw Ridge, where soldiers climbed cargo nets under direct fire into overlapping machine gun and mortar positions. Desmond Doss climbed with them. He carried no rifle, no sidearm, and no protection beyond his medic's gear, moving upward toward a fight that would test every belief he had carried into uniform. The first assault on Hacksaw Ridge unraveled almost immediately. American infantry reached the top of the escarpment in broken clusters, and the moment they exposed themselves, Japanese fire cut across the plateau from multiple directions. Machine guns were hidden inside caves. Mortars dropped without warning. Defensive positions sat on reverse slopes, invisible until they opened fire. Men fell within seconds, often before they understood where the shots were coming from. Radios went quiet. Orders stopped moving. What had looked like a breakthrough collapsed into confusion. Desmond Doss moved forward anyway. While riflemen flattened themselves against the ground, Doss ran upright across open areas, dropping beside wounded soldiers wherever he saw movement or heard shouting. He worked in full view of the enemy. Kneeling in dirt churned by bullets, tying bandages, stopping bleeding, and administering morphine while explosions tore the ridge apart around him. Cover barely existed, and when it did, it filled quickly with wounded men who could not move on their own. The attack stalled under the weight of its losses. By late afternoon, American commanders faced a decision they had hoped to avoid. The ridge could not be held with casualties rising that fast, and staying any longer risked annihilation. The order was given to withdraw. Every man who could move was to descend the cargo nets immediately and regroup below the escarpment. Medics were expected to leave with their units. Dozens of wounded soldiers could not. Some lay unconscious where they had fallen. Others were pinned by injuries too severe to crawl even a few feet. Blood soaked into the dirt as the sound of retreat echoed across the ridge. Every man there understood what nightfall meant. Japanese troops were known to sweep battlefields after dark, killing wounded survivors where they lay. As the last able-bodied soldiers began climbing down the nets, Desmond Doss stayed where he was. He watched his unit disappear over the edge of the cliff, listened as the sounds of battle faded, and waited as darkness settled over the ridge. No officer ordered him to remain. No one volunteered to help. The decision belonged to him alone. Once the ridge fell quiet, Doss began crawling back across the plateau. Without lights or assistance, he moved slowly through shattered rock and mud, guided by sound rather than sight. Every groan, every labored breath drew him forward. When he reached a wounded man, he treated them where they lay, applying pressure, stabilizing injuries, and speaking calmly to keep them conscious. He told each one the same thing, that he was getting them out. The problem was how. The escarpment rose nearly straight down, and carrying a wounded man by hand was impossible. What nobody expected was how quickly Doss adapted. Using rope and knots he had learned long before the war, he tied a makeshift sling, secured the wounded soldier, and dragged them inch by inch to the cliff's edge. Then he began lowering them. Hand over hand, he fed rope through his palms, easing each man down into the darkness below, praying the line would hold and that enemy fire would not cut it. The descent took minutes each time, and every second stretched under the fear of discovery. Once the wounded man disappeared over the edge, Doss whispered the same words into the night. "Lord, help me get one more." And that's when he turned back. Japanese patrols moved across the ridge throughout the night. Flares burst overhead, freezing the battlefield in harsh white light. Several times, enemy soldiers passed close enough for Doss to hear their voices. He pressed himself into the ground, motionless, waiting until they moved on before crawling again. Grenades exploded nearby, throwing dirt and shrapnel across the plateau. One blast knocked him to the ground and left him stunned, but when his senses returned, he checked his hands, gathered his rope, and kept moving. Hours passed this way. Crawl, treat, drag, tie, lower, pray. The ridge became slick with blood and mud. Doss's hands tore open from the rope. His boots were damaged by explosions, forcing him to wrap his feet in cloth torn from his own uniform. Exhaustion shook his body, but stopping never crossed his mind. Each time he finished lowering a wounded man, he went back out again. By the time the sky began to lighten, the ridge was nearly silent. When American forces returned later that morning, they found something they had not prepared for. The wounded soldiers they had been forced to abandon were gone. Men who should have been dead by dawn had been lowered safely down the cliff during the night. Official counts would later credit Desmond Doss with saving at least 75 soldiers during that single night. Commanders argued over the number, insisting it might be lower. Survivors did not debate it at all. They knew who had pulled them back from the edge, one by one, while the battlefield belonged to the enemy. And Doss was still there. He did not ask to be relieved. He did not step back from the line. When the assault resumed, he climbed the ridge again with the infantry, returning to the same ground where he had spent the night alone. The fighting was not finished, and neither was he. Hacksaw Ridge had already become one of the bloodiest positions on Okinawa, and what happened next would push Desmond Doss beyond even that night's endurance. Hacksaw Ridge did not ease after that night, and the Japanese defenses did not break simply because the wounded had been pulled back. When American units resumed the assault, the ridge responded the same way it always had, with sudden machine gun fire, hidden mortars, and cave positions that revealed themselves only when they fired. Desmond Doss climbed the escarpment again with the infantry. The night he spent alone on the ridge had not earned him rest, and he did not ask for it. Moving forward with the next attack, he returned to the same exposed ground, the same shattered terrain, and the same lethal angles of fire. Soldiers who had once questioned his presence now watched him closely, because they knew what staying near him meant if things went wrong. Combat resumed at close range. Japanese fire swept across the plateau as American troops tried to advance, and once again wounded men fell faster than they could be evacuated. Doss moved through the chaos without hesitation, running toward gunfire while others stayed low, dropping beside injured soldiers in open ground. He worked quickly, his movements practiced and calm, tying bandages, stopping bleeding, and administering morphine while bullets snapped through the dirt around him. The result was familiar, but the cost increased. During one of these assaults, a grenade landed near Doss's position and detonated with force. Shrapnel tore into his legs, knocking him down hard and leaving him bleeding in the open. Pain surged immediately, but the injury did not remove him from the fight. Dragging himself across the ground, Doss continued treating wounded soldiers nearby before allowing anyone to look at his own wounds. Only after there was no one else left within reach did he pause. Even then, the ridge had not finished with him. As Doss waited for evacuation, a Japanese sniper fired from concealment. The bullet struck his arm and shattered the bone, leaving it nearly useless. Blood poured down his sleeve, soaking into the dirt beneath him. The injury was catastrophic, the kind that removed most soldiers instantly, but Doss stayed conscious and stayed focused. What nobody expected was what came next. Using his remaining strength, Doss treated his own wound, applying a makeshift splint and stopping the bleeding as best he could. With one functional arm and damaged legs, he began crawling toward cover, pulling himself forward inch by inch across rock and mud. Under continued fire, he covered nearly 300 yards, refusing to stop until his body finally gave out. When stretcher-bearers reached him, the assumption was clear: he would be evacuated immediately. Doss refused. Spotting another wounded soldier closer to the front, he rolled off the stretcher and ordered the medics to take the other man instead. He insisted they leave him where he lay until the more exposed casualty had been carried away. Only after that soldier was safely removed did Doss allow himself to be lifted. By the time he was taken off the ridge, Desmond Doss had been wounded 4 times during the Okinawa campaign alone. Infection followed quickly. In the humid Pacific environment, even minor wounds could turn deadly, and Doss's injuries were far from minor. Surgeons worked to stabilize him as gangrene threatened to spread through his shattered arm. Amputation was discussed. Doss refused again. He insisted the surgeons attempt to save the arm, even if the risk increased, and they complied. The limb was saved, but it never fully recovered. Nerve damage and chronic pain would remain with him for the rest of his life. Months passed as Doss moved between hospitals and recovery wards, drifting through surgeries and rehabilitation while the war moved on without him. During that time, reports from Hacksaw Ridge continued moving up the chain of command. Statements from officers, medics, and infantrymen described the same events from different perspectives. An unarmed medic remaining alone on an exposed battlefield overnight. Wounded soldiers evacuated by hand under enemy movement. Repeated refusal of evacuation even after catastrophic injuries. Each account matched the others closely enough that disbelief became impossible. Commanders argued over details. The number of men saved during the night on the ridge was debated, adjusted, and challenged. But the core facts remained unchanged. Desmond Doss had stayed when ordered to leave. He had returned to fire repeatedly after being wounded. He had placed others ahead of himself every time evacuation became an option. As Okinawa fell and the war moved toward its conclusion, the paperwork caught up with the reality. What Doss had done could not be reduced to a single moment. It was not one act of bravery or one extraordinary decision. It was a sustained pattern of action under conditions where survival alone would have justified withdrawal. The Army had a word for that: valor. Desmond Doss did not leave Okinawa as a symbol or a legend. He left it physically broken and quietly exhausted. The injuries he carried off Hacksaw Ridge were permanent, and recovery did not come quickly or cleanly. Shrapnel damage to his legs, a shattered arm, and repeated infections left his body weakened long after the fighting stopped, and the months that followed were spent moving between military hospitals rather than returning to any sense of normal life. Doctors worked carefully to stabilize wounds that should have been fatal. Infections spread easily in the Pacific climate, and the damage to Doss's arm remained a constant concern. Gangrene returned as a threat more than once, forcing surgeons to consider amputation again. Each time the possibility was raised, Doss refused unless there was no other option, asking the doctors to try everything else first, even if it prolonged recovery or increased risk. The arm was eventually saved, but nerve damage and chronic pain followed him for the rest of his life. While Doss lay in hospital beds, the story of what happened on Hacksaw Ridge moved upward through the chain of command. Eyewitness statements arrived from officers, medics, and infantrymen who had watched events unfold from different angles. Each account described the same pattern: an unarmed medic remaining alone on an exposed battlefield overnight, wounded soldiers evacuated one by one under enemy control, and repeated refusals of evacuation even after catastrophic injuries. The details varied slightly, but the core never changed. Commanders questioned the reports. Numbers were examined closely, especially the claim that dozens of men had been rescued in a single night. Estimates were adjusted downward during review, but even conservative calculations confirmed that at least 75 soldiers owed their lives to what Doss had done on the ridge. Survivors supported the figure without hesitation, many of them stating plainly that they would have been killed before morning if he had not stayed. The paperwork moved slowly, but the conclusion became unavoidable. On October 12, 1945, less than 2 months after Japan surrendered, Desmond Doss stood at the White House wearing a uniform that still fit awkwardly on a body not yet healed. President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck, then paused and shook his hand, telling him directly that he was proud to honor him, words rarely spoken so personally at such ceremonies. With that moment, Doss became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. The citation did not dwell on belief or philosophy. It listed actions: remaining forward under fire, evacuating wounded alone, refusing evacuation, repeatedly exposing himself to danger without regard for personal safety. The language was restrained, almost clinical, as if official wording struggled to capture what had happened on that ridge. Public attention followed briefly, then faded. Doss did not pursue recognition or fame. He returned to civilian life quietly, carrying injuries that shaped every year that followed. Lung disease, nerve damage, and chronic pain limited his ability to work and eroded his health steadily. Daily life became structured around endurance rather than recovery. And the war never fully released him. When asked about Hacksaw Ridge, Doss never framed himself as exceptional. He explained his actions in simple terms, saying that once he saw wounded men left behind, walking away was not an option. Staying was not bravery to him, it was obligation. He believed that every life mattered equally, and that belief did not change under fire, darkness, or isolation. Years passed. Then, decades. Veterans continued to speak his name at reunions. Soldiers who had once mocked him told new recruits about the medic who stayed when everyone else left. His story slowly found a wider audience, not through self-promotion, but through memory passed from those who survived because of him. Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors, recognized not just for what he did on one night, but for the consistency of his actions across an entire campaign. In a war defined by destruction, Doss stood apart not because he refused to carry a weapon, but because he refused to abandon others when survival alone would have justified retreat. On Hacksaw Ridge, courage did not come from firepower or rank. It came from a single decision repeated again and again: to stay, to move forward, and to carry others back when the battlefield belonged to the enemy. If you value real World War II, history told without exaggeration, subscribe to WW2 Heroes for more true stories like this. These videos focus on what actually happened, who was there, and the decisions made under fire, without myths or dramatization. If this story stayed with you, like the video so it reaches others who care about real history, and leave a comment with the name of the next hero you want covered.